There was a small window of time right before the turn of the century when arcade hardware was categorically more powerful than the first few home consoles. At the same time, real-time 3D boards were making the rounds, and developers, especially those from Japan, were competing at the bleeding edge of technology to put out the most impressive-looking games for arcades. During this fire and storm of ideas, some legendary franchises came out on top, like the now renowned Tekken series. But for as much success as it had, and its close relatives and Virtua Fighter had, a slew of games never broke through into the new millennia for long enough to be relevant today, even as nostalgia for older titles continues to grow. In today's DashFight video, we want to walk you through the graveyard of titles that once were, and highlight the ingenuity, the weirdness, and the outright silliness that we would argue was necessary to reach the more polished era of fighting games we now live in. Takara, a giant Japanese toy maker, decided in the mid-80s to enter the growing video game market. In terms of Japanese developer origin stories, this is quite in line with contemporaries. Tamsoft, Takara's video game department, was not entirely new to the video game space, mostly working as a contractor for other projects. Eventually, the company would secure a deal with Sony to make the exclusive launch title for the PS1. Battle Arena Toshinden was a 3D weapon-based fighting game with a small roster of characters. Released in 1995, just a few weeks after Sony's PlayStation 1, it was one of the first of this emerging subgenre of fighting games, right on the heels of Virtua Fighter. However, unlike the first Virtua Fighter, Battle Arena Toshinden was a genuine 3D fighter that gave players the ability to sidestep left or right. It was not groundbreaking by itself, though it did showcase the genre's potential for an audience, and a large one at that, as PlayStation would become one of the most popular consoles in the world. The series would see a sequel come out in December of that same year, spawning a small franchise. However, the release of a very poorly received Toshinden 4 in late 1999 marked the end of the series. A surprising legacy for this series is that in 1996, Earthport Jim became an unlockable character after being ported to DOS machines. It might be the first case of a guest character in a 3D fighting game, even if it was in a palette swap form. Granted, this is not for fighting games as a whole, as X-Men Children of the Atom has it beaten by a few years with Akuma, but we feel it's worth including nonetheless. The Bloody Roar series, created by 18 and Hudson Soft, hit arcades in the original PlayStation in 1997, diving into the genre with a memorable twist: animal transformations. Set in a world of zoanthropes, humans who can transform into powerful animals mid-fight. Basically, imagine animalities from Mortal Kombat, but as a core mechanic of the game. Drawing a line in the history of 3D fighters, it's interesting to see how the whole concept of Bloody Roar's Beast Mode falls within the current framework of the core fighting game mechanics. Install supers were almost non-existent when Bloody Roar was first released, especially ones that would drastically alter your character. Even though Bloody Roar didn't originate them, it's hard to say that it didn't have rippling effect on the genre as a whole. And who knows, maybe its influence spans even as far as Tekken 8. For Bloody Roar, once your beast bar filled, you were able to transform into, well, a beast. Besides the visual change and the added moveset, all the games in the franchise played around with the idea of providing some numerical advantage to this state. In the first game, for instance, this was in the form of heavier characters, a 3% health increase, energy recovery, and jumping distance. The original game by itself had a generally positive reception, at least a good enough one that a series of sequels were greenlit and released from 1998 and until 2003. Throughout all those years, the franchise went through a number of notable publishers, like Sony, Activision, and Konami, where its current IP sits, waiting for its time to come out of the woodwork once more. Okay, that is very unlikely considering Konami's current vision of the video game department. Nevertheless, of all the 3D fighters we are talking about in this video, this is one of the only two series that had spawned multiple sequels, and like Battle Arena Toshinden, it also inspired a short-lived manga series in 2001. Fighter's Destiny is our next stop in 1998. Developed by Genki for the Nintendo 64, its claim to being on this list is its unorthodox victory score system. The system is based on how you actually knock out your opponent, and Fighter's Destiny stages were also designed with that point system in mind. Knocking opponents out of the stage is a ring out worth 1 point. Bringing an opponent down with a throw is worth 2, a standard KO 3, and finally, landing a special attack would score you 4 points, with the default win condition being first to 7. This approach is not wholly unique. Some real-world martial arts like Taekwondo also use a point scoring system, based on the type of hit competitors achieve during a bout. Although the game was well received at the time and went on to have a sequel a year later, it did not catch the player's attention the second time around. Jumping from one N64 title to another, Mace the Dark Age was developed over the course of 2 years inside one of the giants of the industry at the time, Atari. Released in 1997, the game drew heavy inspiration from medieval fantasy aesthetics, and at one point was reported to have built up a roster of about 30 characters, before reducing it back to manageable, though still large at the time, 11-big roster. Gameplay-wise, the game is not that remarkable, and it had very few unique ideas. It shares many of the common ring-out 3D fighter game mechanics, with the limits of the stage dealing damage to the players pushed into them. But it was one of the more solid 3D fighters out on a console that was competing head-to-head with PlayStation. The game got a mixed reception, and interestingly enough, it came to the States a few months later thanks to none other than Midway, NetherRealm Studios' predecessor. It was also supposed to be ported to the original PlayStation at some point, but that never came to be. Even compared to the other games in this video, it has a rather small legacy as one of the many 3D fighters that tried to break through and eventually build an empire of their own. And even though it didn't leave much of a mark, Mace's dark fantasy setting still remains to be somewhat of a novelty. Lastly, let's use that Midway connection for our only non-Japanese made 3D fighter of today. Tao Feng Fist of the Lotus is also our most recent entry. Released in 2003, it was headed by John Tobias, one of the original creators of Mortal Kombat series who, after his contentious exit from the company, joined forces with Microsoft to form Studio Gigante, also based in Chicago. The game's main interest was in realistically portraying the damage of combat. Like Tobias' previous work in Mortal Kombat, showing the flesh bruises and deterioration of the fighters themselves was a key part of what made the game stand out at the time. The game was also interested in telling a story beyond individual fights. It was set on the Pacific coast of the United States after an occupation by China, that later led to a breakaway new state with the impressively uncreative name of New China. And this is just the backdrop to its core story of sects fighting for powerful relics. Ultimately, by the time the game was released, other 3D fighters had it beat in terms of visuals and gameplay. It never sniffed at the chance of a sequel, and Studio Gigante would go down just 2 years after, with only one other game released. There are plenty of stories to tell about those early days of 3D fighters. And as the time inevitably moves forward, we think it's nice to look back at the history of this subgenre of fighting games. Both in terms of early ideas that needed a few more years before fully shining, like Bloody Roar's Beast Mode, to the failures that, even as they are forgotten, their little threads of connection hang on with all their might. So, why not take a second to let us know in the comments, which early 2000s 3D fighter games do you recall having an impact on you? Since we are seeing the resurgence in old 2D titles, do you think that some of these franchises could be up for a nostalgia cycle yet?